right, happy Thanksgiving. Welcome to the Dixiecryptid channel. This is a long podcast for the Thanksgiving weekend. What are you thankful for? I'm thankful for my family, my friends. I'm thankful to be alive, and I'm thankful I get to live in the United States of America, where at least for now, I'm still free. We live in the greatest civilization that has ever existed on this planet. Hang on to it as hard as you can, people. Just hang on to it. And I hope you guys enjoy this podcast. No talking, just stories. All right, here we go. All right, y'all, here's a Bigfoot encounter from California, and I'm going to warn you, it's early in the morning, still dark outside, and one of my roosters is seeing the lights from my office, and he is raising hell. So we're all just going to have to put up with that loud mouth in case he kind of bleeds in on the recording. There he goes again. Good grief. Man, he just never shuts up. All right, well, let's get into this guy's story. I'm going to just read his whole email. Normally, I will not bore you with the things that they say to me or write to me, but I'm going to go ahead and it preempts the story a little bit, so that's why I'm going to use it. He writes, I've had two encounters about a year apart. The first one was in 2019, and the second one was this year. But let's start at the beginning. My name is Uzael. I've always been a Bigfoot believer. I live in the Antelope Valley of California, where from a young age I have researched them. How they mark their territories has always intrigued me, and I've always wanted to see one. I spent a lot of time looking at YouTube videos, seeing how they look and how they walk, but it has always made me mad because of the poor quality of the pictures. I would always furiously declare if I had an encounter, I would take a better picture. I was determined to have an encounter, and when it happened, it wasn't just for a moment or even for a whole day. It lasted for a whole week. Last year, I remember praying to God, saying, God, let me see one. Other people see them, but I haven't. Well, the Bible says, ask and ye shall receive. Well, I did receive. In August, we decided to go camping the week of my birthday. We went to our usual spot in Annette's Mono Village, or Twin Lakes as some people call it, near Mammoth Lake. We invited some friends to join us. We got there at 2 p.m. and set up camp in a fairly deserted area near a bathroom. It's more convenient that way. With bears wandering around, we didn't want to have to make any long hikes to the bathrooms in the middle of the night anyway. My mom and dad had their tent, my brothers had theirs, and I had mine. Our friends who came along also had tents. There was Jack and his family. There was Anthony and John and Anthony's brother. After dinner, we went to bed. John decided to stay in my tent with me the whole week. Around midnight, he woke up saying, hey, they're talking. Well, I told him it was probably bears, but he said, no, I heard talking. It sounds human, but I can't understand it. We were the only people in the campground with our tents scattered all around the site. And I told him, there are creatures called Bigfoot, and they do that. And I motioned for him to be quiet as I slowly unzipped the tent a little so we could look out. He leaned forward to look first, and then he gasped. I covered his mouth and I whispered, what did you see? He said, I saw a tall man and I thought it was a person, but he stretched his arm out and I saw it was covered in hair. And as he got closer to the light, I could tell his whole body was covered in hair. Well, I couldn't believe it. I'd camped here for years and had never seen a Bigfoot. So I said, well, let me see. So I pushed him aside and I looked out, but I couldn't see anything. There was no way we were going to sleep now, so we sat up and we talked for a while. And then there was a crunch. It was the sound of a plastic water bottle being crushed and thrown away. I perked up, hoping that it was what I thought it was. John heard it too and was listening intently for the next sound. I went back to the zipper and carefully peeked outside. But unfortunately, The bottles were in a blind spot, so I couldn't see what was crushing them. Just then, a bear came wandering into the campsite, probably looking for an easy meal. There was another crunch sound from that blind spot, and the bear stopped in its tracks and looked up, and then it ran off. That had to be a Bigfoot. What else could scare a bear off like that? Branches broke to my left, and I turned to try to get a view of the source. And there it was. I could see the mass of hair that covered it. It was huge as it moved between the trees. Man, I was stunned, and to be honest, I wanted it to come closer so I could see more details, but it never did. I thought about how everyone else was asleep except for John and me. We were the only ones awake and hearing everything. I couldn't contain my excitement. I wasn't afraid. I wanted this for too long. And I watched as he moved out of my line of sight. He seemed to stop at that point. I knew he was just outside of my tent, only a few feet, maybe even inches from me. I laid back towards the center of the tent, thinking that if he hits the tent, as I'd read that they do sometimes, he wouldn't hit me. I laid still for several minutes, listening to his breathing. It was deep and raspy and thick with mucus. After 10 minutes, he released a low guttural growl that sounded like a boulder being dragged across an exposed granite, and it vibrated in my chest, raising my anticipation. This was followed, after a few more minutes, by a crisp whistle so clear that it was flawless. It must have been around 2 a.m. when Anthony and Jack woke up to use the restroom. And I heard them, and I jumped out of my own tent to warn them about the Bigfoot who was still there. They scoffed at my words, saying, "You're seeing things. It's probably a bear." I went with them to the restroom, trying to convince them to be careful, but they ignored me. Fortunately, nothing happened, and we all went back to our tents. John and I managed a couple hours of sleep after that. It was now 4 a.m. We were awake again and talking when I noticed where our heads had been, the tent turned lighter. It was like a shadow had been there the whole time that we hadn't noticed, until whatever was creating the shadow had moved. John and I stared at each other, knowing how close it had been without either of us realizing it. By 5:45 a.m., never having managed another minute of sleep, we decided it was time to get up. John peeked out and looked around. "There it is," he said, pointing to a place in the trees. Well, I tried to find it where he was pointing, but I couldn't see anything. "Either you've got better eyes than me, or you're hallucinating," I said with a laugh. But then I saw it. It was a black figure blending in so completely that it would have been easily overlooked by anyone not trying to find it. I was trying to see some kind of detail when John said something behind me. I turned my head for just a second, and when I looked back to the tree line, it had vanished. "Wow, it moved really fast," John said. "It's over behind Jack's tent now." Well, I couldn't see it, but Jack's dog came out of his tent, circled around behind it, and then came running toward us, clearly startled by something. People were waking up about that time. They were coming out of their tents and starting their day. I looked around some more, but all I could see was trees. It would be a few more days before we had another incident. During that time, we'd slept without interruption, except for one night when I awoke and could sense them outside the tent. It was the 4th day of our campout, and we had all decided to go on an 8-mile hiking trip to a lake where we knew the fishing was good. It was 4 miles up and 4 miles back, but well worth the trip, and everyone went. I was stuck at the back of the group with John. He's a big guy who doesn't exercise much, so we were moving quite a bit slower than everyone else, but I didn't mind. He's my friend, and besides, with the wild animals around, traveling alone isn't recommended. At about the 3-mile mark, we were on a part of the trail that zigzagged around. John was covered in sweat and getting tired, so we stopped for a minute, and I noticed another trail that looked like it was more of a beeline to where we were headed, and we decided to take that trail. With a second wind and a burst of energy, John led the way. I was right behind him, looking around us at the new world we'd entered. It was clear that something really big had made this trail. And when we came to some trees that had been snapped in two as far up as 7 to 9 feet, I knew what it was. These trees were pretty thick. No human could do this. And now I got the distinct feeling that we were being watched. I got out my knife and picked up a couple of nice straight sticks. I sharpened them and gave one to John, keeping the other for myself. I figured if we came across this thing and it attacked, at least we'd have some kind of weapon to protect ourselves. We didn't have to worry about that. As far as I knew, we didn't see anything. At the lake, everyone had a good time fishing, and after that, we went for a swim, and then we had to head back to our base camp. That night in our tent, John looked at me with a weird expression on his face, and he said, "Do you remember today when I took off on that trail?" "Yeah," I said, remembering how quickly he'd moved. "Well, I saw something," he admitted. My eyes widened, and I know my expression on my face was one of expectation as I waited for him to explain himself. "There was a dark figure in the trees, and I saw it move from one tree to the next," he said. "I was scared, and I just wanted to get out of there." Well, I was glad nothing had happened, because it was just me and John, and I don't think we would have stood a chance against one of those creatures. We tried to tell the others what we'd seen. We told them about the night one visited our campsite and about the broken trees and the one John had seen on the trail. Of course, no one believed us. It was frustrating because we knew we weren't making this up. Little did we know it wasn't over yet. The entire last night of the camp out, I'd had the feeling of being watched. We had seen bears, they had left, but that feeling didn't leave. And then, from somewhere higher up on the mountain above us, I could hear something bulldozing its way down to our camp. It was breaking trees and making no effort to keep quiet. Someone said it was just a bear, and I told him to point his light in that direction. He could hear it, but he was still doubtful. I ignored him because this was not the behavior of a bear. I told him it was a Bigfoot. Just like the rest of the week, no one was willing to listen this night either. And soon they were all heading off to bed, and it was just me, John, and Anthony left outside. When Anthony got up to head to his tent, John and I followed. Our tents were close together, and we had only John's phone for a light. And suddenly, John stopped in his tracks and he said, "Son of a bitch!" He pointed his light at something in front of him, but before we could see what startled him, he'd taken off for the tent and was frantically trying to unzip it and get inside. Well, we finally caught up with him, and he kept saying, "It's out there, I saw it. It's out there, it's close." Well, this was alarming enough to make us decide to stay in Anthony's tent that night. The next morning, he was finally calm enough to explain what he had seen. He'd been walking along and passed a tree. From somewhere, he was hit by a rock. When he looked around, he saw an 8-foot creature crouch down and stare at him with its green eyes. He was clearly upset by what he had seen, but I was a little bummed out. He'd gotten to see one up close, and I hadn't. We packed up our camp, and we headed home later that day. My second encounter happened in August of this year. These days, I'm known as the guy who sees Bigfoot, but I don't mind. We planned this year to go camping to the same area, but this time neither John nor Jack or his family were able to come. We invited some different friends, and Anthony and his brother came back with us. We planned to stay for 7 days, but because we were told sites were filling up fast, I went up early with 2 of my brothers. We were able to get a good spot with a fireplace and a clear ground. We set up camp, and for 2 days it was pretty uneventful. Then, on the third day, we heard owls that sounded nothing like we'd ever heard before. I can't explain what they sounded like, but they were really different. And when they started, both of my brothers raised their heads. One even said, "That's a Bigfoot." I thought, finally, they're hearing what I'm hearing. They're experiencing what I experience. But when it stopped, after about 10 minutes, one went to bed and the other dozed off by the fire like nothing had happened at all. Suddenly, I heard heavy bipedal footsteps from higher up on the mountain. And I ran down right past my tent. Then it was walking around my tent, clearly on 2 legs. I reached over to my brother, who was dozing by the fire, and I shook him awake. "What?" he said. He was irritated with me. "Listen," I whispered. He sat up and listened as I asked, and even acknowledged that he could hear something. But in the end, he just shrugged his shoulders and announced that he was going to bed, leaving me sitting alone by the fire. I slept out there that night with my knife in my hand. The next morning, I went to make a phone call. We had no cell service at the campsite, so I had to find a place where I could connect to Wi-Fi. On my way back, I saw the police with heavy armory and rifles. And I asked my brothers if they knew what was going on when I got back. They said they'd heard Bigfoot howls, and the next thing they knew, a cop was flying by in his vehicle. Well, that was the day that everyone else showed up to camp. Anthony's brother asked if he could stay in my tent. He was one of the few people who believed me, but he'd had his own experience as well last year. So after 2 uneventful days, we got an idea. He said that we should put out food for him, and I agreed, but said that it should be hung high so we know only the Bigfoot are getting it. I did have second thoughts before we did it, saying that we could cause them to get aggressive, but Anthony ignored me and did it anyway. He hung his bag of marshmallows and chips around my tent, and I was angry and pointed out that he was making me part of the bait. And I told him these things are smart and they'll figure out there's more food in the tent and they'll try to get inside. And again, he ignored me. To make matters worse, Anthony's brother was a deep sleeper. Nothing woke him up. I'm the opposite. I went to bed early that night while Anthony's brother and some of the others went night fishing. They came in late, waking me up in the process, of course. Later that night, I woke up again, this time the sound of what I first thought was Anthony's brother eating chips. Soon I realized that something wasn't right. It was like something was running up and grabbing the chips and then running off to eat them, and then it would run back and get some more. It was definitely bipedal, but just as definitely not human. Then it ran up to the opening of the tent, and I felt something tapping on my toes like it was testing what it was feeling to determine what it was. Well, I flipped out, and at this point, I didn't care if Anthony's brother was a deep sleeper or not. He was going to wake up. And I was pounding him as hard as I could and hissing at him to wake up. "What?" he muttered in a half-conscious state. "Something's grabbing my toes," I said. Confused, he sat up and looked at his own hands. I know he was trying to clear the fog, but just for a second I thought, is he waiting for his hands to confess? "Let's have a look and see what's out there," he finally said. And before I could react to that statement, the tent bent in as if something was leaning on it. I hit at it, and it bent back, but I knew it was out there wanting inside, probably wanting some more chips. My adrenaline was flowing like an open spigot as I watched something clumsily pull at the zipper. And I jumped back and I pulled the inflatable bed in front of me to form a shield while I waited for the tent to move again or the zipper to unzip, but nothing happened. We sat in the middle of the tent, tense and jumping at every sound. The long night wore on with every minute wearing on our nerves while we waited, never knowing when something might get in and try to make us into its next meal. And then at 3 a.m., something pressed down on the top of the tent. It was like long fingers pressing, being dragged along the ridge and exploring. I had to use the restroom pretty bad by now, but I was thinking, what if this thing wants to kill me? I held my bladder until 5 a.m. when I heard my brother get out of his tent to use the restroom. Finally, I climbed out of my tent and I joined him, hoping there would be safety in numbers. And as we walked to the restroom, I told him everything that had happened, but he scoffed and he said it was just a bear. He might have believed me, but then he saw the chip bag and it looked like it had been ripped open by claws. After that, I chose to go to sleep at my grandparents' nearby cabin. Anthony and his brother were angry at me, but I told them that they would sleep through anything and I haven't slept at all. I needed a good night's sleep. The night I was gone, the Bigfoot had come back and sounded mad and aggressive. And I told them that that's what happens when you try to feed these things. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but these are my stories, and I hope you either gathered information or at least enjoyed them. This is a real good one. Hope you guys enjoy it. The writer says, thank you for your channels, Dixiecryptid and the What If It's True podcast. I do a lot of driving with my job, and I have two brothers that are truck drivers. When I found your channels, I told my brothers, and we all subscribed. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. The story I'm about to tell you, I have kept secret for 30 years. I've never shared this with anyone. It's always troubled me, and you'll see why I never told anyone. I'm in my mid-50s now, but when I was 19 years old, I lived in the mountains of North Carolina. I hunted on public land. I had a place I liked to go that was so hard to get to that I've never seen anyone else up there. It was several miles from the closest parking area, and you had to climb up the side of a ridge to get there. The first time I went there, the squirrels would hang down from the tree limbs just curious as to what I was. I don't think they had ever seen a human before. Once at the top, there's a leveled off place where a huge oak tree grew, and you could see clearly for 100 yards before it got thick with laurel bushes again. I was up there on a Saturday and I found where an old hollowed out oak had broken off 5 feet above the ground. One side had a huge crack running down to the ground, and I got inside and even hunkered down, and I could see the open area clearly. It was a perfect blind, and I was standing in this blind watching for deer when I heard a commotion coming from the other side of the ridge north of me. I squatted down and I watched through the big crack. A small doe came over the ridge toward me, but I knew immediately something was wrong with her because she was dragging her back legs. My first thought was that she'd been shot by another hunter and crippled. Then I heard something else coming across the ridge, and it was not being quiet at all. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. A reddish-colored Sasquatch, 5 to 6 feet tall, came across the ridge. I'd never seen one of these, and although I was only 19 at the time, I had spent an amazing amount of time in the woods. I'd even camped up here with no fire or tent ever. I had friends who had sightings, but I never believed them. I thought they had just misinterpreted what they had seen, but here one was right in front of me and only 60 yards away. The deer was trying to drag herself away, but the Squatch would grab her and drag her a ways back and then let her go again. Every time it would grab her, she let out, I guess you would call it a sort of a scream. It was hard to watch. Then the Squatch put its foot right on the doe's head, and then it looked up into the sky and started laughing. Now I know this sounds crazy, but that's what it was doing. It was laughing. And then it let go of the doe, and when she got so far away, it dragged her back. And this went on for 20 minutes. The more I watched this, the more angry I got. This beast was torturing this deer, and he was enjoying it. I decided that I'd had enough, and I decided to shoot the deer, and if this thing came after me, I would put it down as well. And I pulled my rifle up, and it put its foot on the doe's head, and it started laughing again. I don't know what happened in my thought process, but when I pulled the trigger, it was at the squatch, not the deer. I put a round in its left eye, and it dropped instantly. My honest first thought was, damn, that was a good shot. My second thought was, I need to reload. I slid another round in my 7 mag, and then I heard a freight train coming from the same ridge that the doe and squatch had come from. Topping the ridge was a huge 9-foot-tall monster. She was huge and solid black. She stood only for a second before seeing what had to be her child. She jumped over to the younger one and she knelt down. She pushed the smaller one and made a kind of cooing noise. And then she made a blood-curdling roar. Right then, the doe tried to get up again. She was on it in a second, and she picked up the doe and started beating her against a nearby tree like someone beating out a rug. I could barely breathe, and I sunk lower and lower where I was. This thing was throwing a tantrum like no other. She finished with the doe, who was in no way still alive, and started ripping up 3 to 6 inch saplings and breaking them like toothpicks. After 20 minutes of running back and forth, she started to wear down, and she went back to the smaller one and laid down beside it, and then started what I can only describe as crying. It is one of the saddest things I've ever witnessed. Her moaning will haunt me for the rest of my life. She picked up her child and went back over the ridge howling with sadness. And as her wails of pain gradually faded off in the distance, I got up and I left the area. I've never been so scared in my life since then, and I've never been back to that area, but I do still hunt. I've never shared this because I'm ashamed of what I did. I'm certainly not excusing my actions, but anyone in my shoes could have done the same thing. I'm not saying they would have, but they could have. Well, that's all I have to say. Thanks for reading my story. Keep up the great work. We really love the Steve Lilly stories. And he's saying he signs the email. All right, another anonymous writer. I've been listening to your channel for a few months since my best friend recommended it to me, and your show is fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I love the stories, especially the ones that occur in locations I've been to myself. They make me wonder what I've been missing in the woods when I'm there, but the story I'd like to share is an experience that went far beyond my imagination. I've been a firm believer in Bigfoot since the age of 7, when I discovered its tracks in the snow behind my house in New Jersey where I grew up. That was in 1973, and it would be 45 years before I had another encounter with the elusive cryptid, and this one was really strange. I still don't know exactly what to make of it. On August 21, 2017, the day the solar eclipse traversed the entirety of the United States, my wife and I took a 90-minute trip from our home in western North Carolina to the Cowpens National Battlefield in Gaffney, South Carolina, to view the eclipse. Our house was just outside the area of totality, but the battlefield was inside of it. We arrived about 20 minutes before the eclipse started, and we milled about in the open area around the visitor center. Cowpens Battlefield is a flat, thinly wooded park that allows a visitor to see 100 yards in every direction. There were approximately 75 people sitting in our immediate area, and I could see perhaps 100 more walking across the battlefield proper from my viewpoint. Many of the people brought their dogs that day, too. When the eclipse got underway, naturally all eyes turned to the sky, and viewing it with their paper glasses. I was also looking at the moon crossing the sun's path, but a few seconds after the totality of the eclipse started, my attention was diverted by low, disturbing grunting sounds coming from nearby my spot. I never heard sounds like this before. They seemed to be a combination of human grunts and pig snorts, only much louder and deeper than a man or pig could make. It also sounded pretty upset, like it'd been woken up when it didn't want to be. It didn't come from any of the dogs present either. Whatever made the sounds came from something far larger than the biggest dog present. Besides, once it got dark, all the dogs just lay in the grass and they stayed quiet. I know that animals are supposed to behave strangely during an eclipse, but I've never known a dog not to bark its head off at the sound of a pin drop, day or night. It seemed as if they weren't aware of what I was hearing, and I was soon to discover that that was virtually the truth. Before I could say anything, my wife, who is much less a believer in Sasquatch than I am, turned to me and asked, "Is that a Bigfoot I hear?" The grunting continued for nearly 2 minutes. It was kind of hard simultaneously watching the eclipse and figuring out where the sound emanated, but I finally pinpointed the sounds coming from a thin patch of trees and brush 50 yards from us. I wouldn't call this patch thick woods. It was only 100 feet long and 20 feet wide, and I could clearly see the battlefield and the people in the field behind it. I don't think even a toddler could successfully hide in that scrub, but that's where the grunting originated. But nothing was there. Not only didn't I see anything, but looking around, no one else present even seemed to be aware of it besides my wife and I. I could see them watching the eclipse and going on with their conversations, and not one person even looked in the direction of the grunting. Eventually, as the eclipse ended, the grunting faded, and then it stopped. The dogs jumped up from the grass and started prancing around. The people lowered their heads and made to leave, and I was left to scratch my head and figure out what it was I had just experienced. I've heard alleged Bigfoot recordings before, the howls, the whistles, the supposed Sasquatch language, and while I can't say that what I heard resembled those recordings, all I could think of was that the sounds could only have come from something as large as a Bigfoot, and yet there was nothing I could see making the sound. I have never put much stock into the hypothesis that Bigfoot possesses paranormal abilities such as invisibility, dimensional travel, or telepathy. I've always wanted to believe that it was a biological, terrestrial creature like you, me, and every other form of life on Earth, but this experience has me questioning those beliefs. Why was it that only my wife and I heard the sounds in the field full of people? Why couldn't I see it when it should have been obvious in that thin patch of woods? Did the eclipse have anything to do with this? It would be nice to find out the answers to those questions. There have been several credible sightings of Bigfoot within a 20-mile radius of my house in the last several years, but I don't think he's going to sit down and explain it to me. Thanks for letting me share my story. You can use my name if you like. Okay, this sure enough is a Bigfoot story, and the writer definitely wants to be anonymous. But here is his story, and I think it's going to be very intriguing for you. He writes, "I was 18 years old when this happened. I lived in Connecticut. I'm 50 years old now. This is the first time I've spoken of this. In fact, I had to explain it all to my wife because she wasn't interested in hearing that I'm writing a long email about nothing. At the age of 16, I moved out of my house to live with my cousin and his wife. They lived on a farm that my cousin's wife's family had owned for years. They had over 100 acres of property that was backed up by water company property, so to say that this was the most woods I'd ever seen was an understatement. They had all the animals you would expect to see on a farm, but the family's main source of income were their cows. They raised both milk and meat cows, and they all roamed free in separate fields. These people were adamant about not letting strangers on their land, and they had no problem expressing their no hospitality rules. Me bringing friends onto the property was also frowned upon. Their driveway was 6/10 of a mile long, just over half a mile. It was an unpaved rocky stretch of driveway. If you didn't own a truck or an SUV and didn't know how to maneuver it, you would definitely do damage to your vehicle. You'll understand why I'm including the trivial description of the driveway later in the story. I spent a lot of time in those woods hunting and fishing, and after a while, I noticed that there were quite a few man-made trails that went all over the property. Some went straight to some little pop-up trailers that were always there. No one ever stayed in them, but I saw that they seemed to be caches for storing hunting rifles. There were 4 of these little campers all over their property, and if there were more, I never saw them. When I asked about these campers, I was told that they used to get a lot of poachers on the property, and it was a way to scare people off if you fired a weapon into the air. Well, that answer was a good answer, but it still seemed weird that these people held on to so many guns. There were even a few nights that I was called upon to help scare off trespassers, but I never actually saw any. There was definitely a problem with animals going missing on this farm, so it all seemed normal to be woken in the middle of the night to run out in the woods with a shotgun and fire a few shells in the air. Over the course of the 2 years I had been there, I got to know the property well. I also got used to walking in the middle of the night, but I don't care who you are, if you spend any time alone in the woods, especially at night, it can be scary. I think back now and I realize there were things that happened and we never gave it a second thought. Late one night, my cousin, his wife, and myself were called because her parents said the pigs had gotten loose. When we got to the pig pen, we saw that the door had been ripped off, and we assumed that it was probably a coyote or a wolf. I don't know if you've ever had to try to catch baby pigs, but it isn't easy. It took us hours to round up the baby pigs except for one, and we assumed it got away and we forgot about it. There were times I remember having to get out of bed in the middle of the night for weird reasons. On another night, we were told that there were raccoons in the barn making a mess. And when we got to the barn, we called our parents on the walkie-talkies to let them know that we were there, and they said to stay outside and fire a few rounds into the air. And do not go in the barn, they said. Well, we shot a few times into the sky. We heard noises inside the barn. And at this point, her parents were just arriving on a couple of ATVs. They said for us to stay put because the raccoons would leave on their own. One morning, her parents told us to go squirrel hunting because they were eating at the electrical wires in the barn. We all headed out there with our shotguns. And after an hour, we split up to cover more ground. I found myself in one of the huge fields and started walking across, not thinking about where I was exactly. The wind was blowing hard and it was all I could hear. But even in the wind, I heard my cousin screaming. And I turned to see where the sound was coming from, and I saw my cousin standing on the other side of the field several hundred yards away. At that distance, I could not see him well, but it had to be him. We were the only people out there. Well, he screamed a second time, and when I looked over at him, it occurred to me where I was. I had not been paying attention. I was in the field where they kept their stud bull. And I could see the brute coming at me, and as luck would have it, I was close to the fence and was able to get on the other side before the bull made it to me. I started working my way around the field, and after an hour, I ran into my cousin and his wife. I said, "That was crazy. Thank you for the heads up on that bull. I didn't realize I was in the bull's field." Well, my cousin looked at me like I was off my rocker. "What the hell are you talking about? And why were you in that field? We didn't warn you about the bull." "Well, who screamed at me then?" Now we suspected a trespasser had warned me, but why would he do that if he was trespassing? We split up again and searched for this person for a while, but we never found anyone. Not long after this event, I came home from a date around 3 a.m. My new girlfriend drove us that night, and she let me off at the end of the rough driveway because her car wouldn't make it to the house. The last thing I heard were her tires crunching gravel and then fading to nothing. It was freezing cold, and it was silent that night, no wind. I had walked this driveway hundreds of times, and it was always creepy at night. Some nights when the moon wasn't out, I had to be careful where I stepped. However, on this night, the moon gave me plenty of light to see. I was in a good mood after spending the evening with this girl, and my mind was there and not in the present. I heard a sound, and that stopped me. It almost sounded like a deer huffing or blowing, but it was too loud for that. Tuning everything out of my mind, I listened closely. Something was walking toward me in the woods next to the drive. Whatever it was walking at a normal pace, and it wasn't rushing me, and it was clearly on 2 legs. I stepped backward 20 paces or so. My mind told me it was a poacher coming down the game trail. Well, that seemed reasonable. In a minute, I would be face to face with this person if they kept coming, so I crouched low, almost flat to the ground, with my legs still under me. It would be better if this guy never saw me and just kept on going. And once he was by me, I would sprint to the house and get help. So making myself small as possible, I waited. Finally, this guy stepped into the clear and onto the road, but it wasn't a poacher. One more step and he was in the middle of the drive, even closer to me. Maybe I had made a noise, or maybe it was a sense he had about things, but as he was about to take another huge step, he stopped. He looked right at me. No human could have seen me off in that area that I was in, but he saw me. Now, terrified, I locked onto this thing and I never took my eyes away. It was huge and covered in hair, and steam rose from its wet shoulders, back, and head. Illuminated in the moonlight, it was the scariest image I have ever seen. The only option left for me was to run, and I was about to, when a sense of peace and calm came over me. It was instant, like a switch had been turned on in my mind and in my body. The way it looked at me was strange, almost as if it had pity on me, like it knew I was terrified and it didn't want to scare me anymore. The giant creature took one step back into the woods, only one step, and then it was gone. I heard it walk up the hill, crunching leaves and twigs as it walked, and then the night faded into silence again. In the welcome silence, I stood and gazed into the lit woods in front of me, and I began to shake. I realized what I had encountered, and I vomited, and finally regained composure, and then I casually walked the half-mile to the house. Later that night, after going to bed, I lay there thinking for hours. The family I lived with knew about these things, or this thing. That was the reason that they were adamant about keeping trespassers off their property. It wasn't people they were worried about, it was this thing. But the trespassers weren't people, and it explained the guns and the warning shots. And now I knew why they kept us out of the barn that night when we heard the noises of the raccoons. And it was now clear to me who had yelled at me on the edge of the bull field and saved my life that night. This story has a title to it. It says Dad's Bigfoot Story. It's pretty good. My story isn't about a specific encounter, but more where my fascination for the creature comes from. My father was a man's man. He was a World War II veteran and an avid outdoorsman. He worked in the oil fields of America and drove a truck, and he was generally a tough guy. He taught me and my brothers, all 6 of us, about hunting and fishing, among other life lessons. He grew up in Great Depression America and knew how to make the most out of very little. He was, all in all, a good man. In the 1980s, he was working for an oil company checking wells in southwest Oklahoma. This region isn't known for Bigfoot sightings or encounters. It was just becoming knowledgeable that eastern Oklahoma may have Bigfoot-type creatures. Dad had come home one afternoon excited and began telling us about what he found. He had had extra time on his hands and was going to check out a pond near one of the oil leases. He had been given permission to fish there. While walking the bank of the pond, he found a log that had been ravaged by something. Dad said the log was hollow and it looked like a rabbit or a critter had made the log its home. But what excited Dad was the log being destroyed the way it was. He said the log was completely torn apart, and inside was a pile of fur from what he could only assume was a rabbit. Investigating the log, he also found a few strands of coarse long hair. My father was a rational man, and he knew a coyote would not have destroyed a log like that. There were no significant tracks around the log, even in the soft dirt. He told us, and most anyone who would listen about this, the story never changed each time he told it. He was known to tell a tall tale or two, usually for a laugh, and you could always tell when my father was joking. When he told this story, he never varied or changed his tone. It was always exactly the same. A few months later, he took me out to the pond to look at the site of the log and to look at the pond again for the best fishing spots. It was February or March. I was 14 years old. Dad pointed out where the log had been, and he told me to go check it out and look for prints while he finished checking the levels on the tank battery or whatever he did on those wells. It was 200 yards from the truck, and I held no fear of woodland creatures, especially in the middle of the day. While I was down by the pond near the spot, I kept getting the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a foreboding sense of danger, just a feeling that I was being observed. There were no forest sounds except for the wind, and I chalked that up to being late winter. Therefore, there wasn't a lot of creatures about to make noise. Dad later found In Search Of episodes, and we watched them every time they came on. There weren't a lot of documentaries about Bigfoot on television, but when a story came on about the creature, he would watch it, and that was much to the aggravation of my mother. This is where my fascination about cryptid creatures comes from. He believed they were real, and he was ridiculed, or people just thought old Alan was BSing them again. But I never questioned my dad. He knew that the creature passed through the area, and that was good enough for me. Were he alive today, he would be listening to every podcast he could find, every story he could listen to about Bigfoot. He definitely would enjoy Dixiecryptid. I know this isn't much of a Bigfoot encounter, but this was the beginning of my journey down the cryptid rabbit hole, and one small bond I held with my dad. I believe that Dad saw or heard something more than that log that day. He just never told anyone about it. Oh, I can't remember if this writer said it was okay to use his name, so I'm just not going to use anybody's name in this podcast because I can never be sure, but this was a great story, and the very last paragraph was perfect. There was a bond he held with his dad, and it got him interested, and his imagination peaked into looking into these reports and stories and videos and all the things that people do about Bigfoot on the internet. And I just think it's awesome. I think it's an awesome story, and he has great memories of his dad. Thank you for the story. It was wonderful. Okay, this isn't necessarily a Bigfoot story, but it is a good story. It's a hunting story. Everybody likes a good hunting story, and I think you guys are going to find this captivating. The writer says, during trapping season in 1984, my friend and I went up to his family's cabin on the Muscatatuk River to set our trap lines. Okay, everybody make sure and make a comment and correct me on that pronunciation, because I just mangled it and blew it. But I can barely read that word. That day, a mangy blue-tick hound kept following us around while we were setting our traps. At daybreak the next morning, we were up and stoking up the fire and getting ready to check our traps. A very thick fog blanketed the area. While we were sitting around the campfire, a voice that seemed to be coming from a well called out, "Have y'all seen my coon dog around here?" Well, we nearly jumped out of our skins. We were at a remote camp, yet the hollow voice sounded like it was right beside us. I slowly eased my hand toward my rifle and I yelled out, "Is it a blue tick hound?" I'll never forget how he answered. The eerie, dejected voice simply replied, "No." My buddy was getting nervous. By this time, I had my rifle in my hand, and I called out, "Why don't you come on into camp, have some coffee?" There was silence for a moment, and then the voice asked, "Are y'all trapping?" Well, I said we were, and then got up to try to locate him in the fog. My buddy was already looking around and he whispered to me, "I can't see him. I can't tell where he's at." All of a sudden, the fog began to lift. We frantically searched around for the man that belonged to the eerie voice. I looked toward the river and I spotted the figure of a man with a fedora hat and a plaid hunting shirt. I ran toward the figure, waving my arms, saying, "Who should we contact if we see the dog?" As I got close, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief. He appeared to be an image projected onto the fog, and as the fog began to break up, his projection began to break up with it. He shouted out a name, and it escapes me to this day. And as the fog lifted, we went down to where I saw him, but there were no tracks. The rest of the weekend was uneventful. And when we got back to Clarksville, we told my buddy's dad about what had happened. He said that he had heard stories about a ghost that roamed the river bottoms around North Vernon. 20 years later, I was at a historical reenactment in southern Ohio. A bunch of us were standing around a campfire one evening, passing around a bottle of whiskey and telling stories. Two of the guys were from the North Vernon area. The bottle came my way, and after a stiff shot, I started to tell my story. A buddy and I had something weird happen to us up on Muscatatuk River one time. One of the men from North Vernon interrupted me. He asked, "Did a man ask you about a coon dog?" My look told him the answer, and he told me the story that was passed down through his family. The ghostly hunter once had a number of children and was a widower and a passionate raccoon hunter. He dearly loved his children and was their sole support. Well, one night he lost his dog out while hunting. And fearing to lose his treasured hound, the hunter left his oldest child in charge and went out searching. And tragically, he died that night, never finding his beloved hound or getting back to his children. As the years pass, my memory fades, and I try to convince myself that someone had shouted at us from a couple of 100 yards away, and it was just the fog playing tricks on my ears. But in the back of my mind, I know what happened that day, and I know I'm lying to myself to think otherwise. That's what people do when they don't have reasonable explanations for supernatural events. Looking back, there was nothing malicious about the ghostly hunter. He asked a few questions and he was gone. And to this day, fishermen, hunters, and trappers along the Muscatatuk River still have encounters with him, or so I've been told. All right, here's another email. I think you guys are going to really like this one. The man writes, I'm in my 60s and I'm battling with MS, and I've decided to share my experiences before it's too late. Perhaps my encounters will benefit someone, and if so, then my time writing this has not been wasted. I was raised on a farm and cattle operation in Utah in the 60s and 70s. Our land was adjacent to foothills that led up into a range of the Rocky Mountains where I spent every possible hour on horseback or hiking or backpacking. I logged several hundred nights camping out during my teens and 20s and 30s and even into my 40s. It came with the territory of my outdoor life. Being out of doors every day from my childhood onward gave me a tremendous education about the natural world, and I was intimately familiar with every species of tree, all plants and wildflowers, and every type of bird that inhabited our region, and of course, every mammal that lived in these valleys and mountains. I grew up fly fishing and hunting waterfowl, upland birds and varmints and big game, which took me into some of the most beautiful and remote country imaginable. I mention these things so you'll understand my familiarity with every living thing from the western deserts to Utah red rock country and the alpine peaks of the highest mountains. In all that time that I spent outdoors, I never had any cause for fear, nor did I see or experience anything unusual. And then one August evening in 2004, my fly fishing partner and I decided to stay out and watch the Perseid meteor shower at Strawberry Reservoir. We were excited to see the spectacle because of the clear skies, and there would be no moonlight and no light pollution. We launched our float tubes into the water shortly before dark to enjoy some fly fishing and stargazing. Perhaps an hour into the meteor shower, we both suddenly noticed something massive walking along the shoreline on all fours. Its silhouette instantly reminded me of a polar bear with its huge hindquarters taller than its front shoulders, and its head was small for its body size that was gargantuan. We were way too close to the shore for comfort and paddled into the safety of deeper water as quickly as possible, and we both experienced a sense of dread and terror. What was this giant thing? It was several times larger than the biggest black bear we had ever seen, and Utah doesn't have grizzly bears, which are not that large anyway. We observed the creature for a couple of minutes until it walked into the darkness and left us alone in the lake. Yeah, we were both terrified, knowing that eventually we'd have to get out of the water and run up the hill to the SUV. We had no explanation for what we saw, and back then I'd never heard of Bigfoot walking on all fours. And since that time, I've read numerous accounts of people seeing these things down on all fours. It's the only answer I can come up with to account for the massive size of the animal we witnessed. The experience we had on Strawberry that August night was a precursor for the year of 2005, where everything changed and my life has never been the same since. A doorway was opened somehow to extraordinary strangeness that I never asked for, didn't seek, and I can't seem to escape. As this is the one and only time I will record and recount these experiences, I will do my best to give you a detailed account of what happened in our lives during 2005 and subsequent to that time. It all began innocently enough on a late winter day when my wife and I decided to go for a drive to town to get a taco for lunch. On the return trip, we were 2 blocks south of Main Street in our small town when suddenly a dog of some kind with short, dark gray hair walked out into the street in front of us. It was on 2 legs, and I slammed on the brakes as we watched this thing cross the road in disbelief. It ran into someone's yard on 2 legs and went into the shrubbery out of sight. We were speechless. What the hell was that? We went home and I got online, and it didn't take long to find numerous images and videos of these same dogs walking upright all over the southwest of the United States and down into Mexico. Some people refer to them as chupacabras. All I know is that we were both very upset by what we witnessed. A few weeks later, it was time for another friend and I to go on our first Jeep expedition of the season, and we headed south toward Utah's San Rafael Swell. It's some of the most remote country in the lower 48s. And on the way, we passed through San Pete Valley, where the second strange encounter took place. At the north end of the valley, there's a small town called Milburn, and just as we turned off the highway to head toward Milburn, there was a huge black figure standing in low sagebrush and cheatgrass at perhaps 60 yards away. I brought the Jeep to a halt, and we both stared at this thing with very broad shoulders and legs like tree trunks. We weren't close enough to make out any facial features, but could see the glistening black hair that covered this being, and a conical-shaped head, a barrel chest, long arms, narrow waist, and massive legs. Time stopped as we watched this thing for a few seconds, and then it turned its body to the south, took 2.5 steps, and then it vanished. There was nowhere for it to hide. It didn't dash to a tree for cover or drop to the ground. It was midway into its third step with one leg raised and its foot up off the ground when it completely disappeared. It wasn't as though we watched it step into some unseen doorway where you'd observe the front part of the creature disappear, followed by its backside. Not at all. It totally vanished in one instant of time in mid-stride. You can imagine the fear that swallowed us knowing that we had to drive down the road where this thing was headed when it vanished. At that time, I had never researched anything about Bigfoot, though I was certainly familiar with the claims of those who had seen those things. I didn't know there was a rich collection of encounters with these things vanishing from sight, but we both saw it in one moment, and the next it was gone. After the event concluded, we compared notes and both felt like it was 9 feet tall and it weighed perhaps as much as 600 pounds, maybe more. It didn't make any aggressive movements toward us. However, we both felt a deep foreboding sense of evil. We couldn't shake that horrible feeling, and we decided to postpone our Jeep adventure for another time. The next in our series of life-changing events occurred during the spring when we were doing some landscaping work in our yard. We lived a couple of miles outside of town and didn't have any close neighbors at the time. I hesitate to record this incredibly strange event because no one will believe me. Still, it's the most disturbing of the events of 2005. And to leave a full and honest account, I'll tell you this part of my story. It still turns me inside out when I think about it. My oldest son was 17 at the time, and he was helping me with some landscaping work. We stopped for lunch, and while I was eating a sandwich in the house, I was looking into the backyard at our project and deciding what we'd work on next when I saw a male American kestrel hawk flying toward a river birch tree in the back corner. But something was wrong with the bird, and I thought it was perhaps injured due to its erratic flight. Rather than landing in the tree, the small and colorful hawk landed on the ground where we had been planting some barberry bushes, and it started moving its wings in a strange, unnatural way. And the next thing I knew, this bird pushed its wings up and away from its body in a manner that would be impossible for any bird to do. And then I was looking at something other than the hawk. More than 16 years have passed since this event occurred, and I no longer remember the exact order of what I witnessed. But over the next several minutes, I observed this thing change shapes into a rabbit with badly deformed ears, a squirrel that was incorrectly formed, then a weasel, a marmot, a badger, each of which was anatomically incorrect. At the same time as I witnessed this event, I was suddenly sick to my stomach and filled with nausea and a violent headache. The badger jumped down from the retaining wall and went over to a hole in the field. My son came upstairs at that point, and I asked him to keep watching the hole while I went over there. I went through the garbage and I picked up a stout club I carried with me, and when I got to the hole, nothing was there, and I retreated to the couch where I rested for a few hours to recover. Later research uncovered a material known as black goo, or programmable matter, that might account for what I saw. Perhaps it was something from the military or the deep state. I don't know. Debilitating nausea continued for the next couple of weeks anytime I went outside near where I'd seen that thing. Perhaps it was some kind of radioactivity. The next two events occurred on the same day. I was fly fishing with my partner at a different stillwater known as Schofield Reservoir. It was a gorgeous late spring day and the fishing was good. The sky was a stunning azure blue with white fluffy clouds hanging low in the sky. At one point, I looked almost straight above me and gasped at seeing a very large silver sphere in the sky that appeared to be covered in radio towers. It was not very high above me as it was hovering between two of the low-hanging clouds. And as soon as I saw it, the thing rapidly ascended and was gone from sight in mere moments. And then on my way home as we left the mountains and reached Highway 6, we both saw a glowing orange orb coming toward us in the opposite lane of traffic. My friend commented that it was about the size of a basketball. We watched it pass us and turned to watch it go behind us, but it disappeared. Later that summer, my friend would go fishing at Indian Creek Bay on Strawberry Reservoir, where he saw two orbs the same evening. Our lives were becoming very weird. What in the world was happening to us? Well, this story is becoming so long, so I'll skip the next orb story. It's not that critical. We finally reached July 4th. And after all the activities of the day, my wife and I were sitting on the back patio watching fireworks in the towns east of where we lived. We had an unobstructed view for many miles in every direction. And after the fireworks ceased, we sat there enjoying the cool of the evening until almost midnight when she grabbed my arm and said, "What is that?" pointing up at the sky about halfway between our home and the mountains to the east. Neither of us spoke for a few minutes as we observed a huge triangular-shaped craft move silently across the sky. It had running lights along the top and bottom edge of the side we could see, and once it passed, we could see the back end, which also had running lights. It continued moving north until we lost sight of it. We were both two small-town kids that couldn't understand why these inexplicable things were happening to us. But that was not the last unidentifiable thing we saw flying in the skies that year, but it was the most remarkable one we saw. Sometime in August of 2005, my fishing partner called me late one evening and said to go outside and look above the prominent mountain in our valley. Well, I did so, and to my surprise, there was a new, very bright star in the sky we had never seen before, and it was flashing colors at an immense rate of change. My friend had the latest and most powerful camera with a fantastic zoom lens, and he filmed the star, which not only flashed colors we couldn't name, but changed shapes each time it flashed. We watched it in slow motion, and we were astonished by the revelation of what his camera brought into focus. And over the years since 2005, we've witnessed many such anomalies. By late September of that year, the heat of the summer was behind us, and it was time to attempt the Jeep expedition once again. We made plans to explore a section of the San Rafael Swell that we had never visited. On our drive to the swell, we once again passed through Sandpeat Valley and of course discussed the Bigfoot sighting from the spring. That was not my friend's first cryptid encounter, as I learned. After we passed the location of the sighting, we both gave an audible sigh of relief and proceeded on our way. Partway through the valley, we decided to explore a range of hills we'd never visited before, and we pulled onto a gravel road that led up into the hills. I stopped the Jeep on a bridge over a small irrigation canal as we looked ahead, trying to decide which way we wanted to go. It was 11 a.m., and that's when I noticed movement below me and to the left in my peripheral. When I looked directly at whatever had moved, I was instantly paralyzed with fear and incapable of movement or of speaking. Time absolutely stopped, and I couldn't even breathe. There below me, kneeling in the canal, was a monster covered in grizzled hair, a mixture of gray and light brown, with golden yellow-colored eyes that were far apart and a wide mouth and narrow lips that were closed tightly together. I could not look away, and I couldn't move as time stood still and I had a long look at this thing. The hair on its forehead began at the brow ridge and grew upward on its forehead until it reached the top of the head that was cone-shaped. The hair was a uniform 1 inch in length, and the hair on its face gave it a perfect full beard that grew up close to its eyes, leaving only a small patch of charcoal gray skin around the eyes. It never blinked. The nose was wider and flatter than a human nose, and hair grew across part of its nose. The space between the bottom of its nose and its upper lip was much wider than with humans, at least twice as wide and even maybe more. The shoulders on this beast were 4 feet wide and massive with muscle. The hair was longer on its shoulders, maybe 3 or 4 inches long. There wasn't much neck to speak of, and it looked like its head rested on its shoulders. The head was too small to match the massive shoulders, and its chest was full and rounded and covered in hair a couple of inches long. The shoulder muscles and biceps were incredibly huge, and because of its position in the canal, I couldn't see its elbows, lower arms, or hands. I also couldn't see below its chest. I never saw the legs at all. I have assumed all these years that as I was parked on the bridge and the motor was running, it must have disturbed the creature that may have been sleeping or resting under the bridge, and it came out to investigate the source of the noise, but I'm just guessing. After taking a long look at this thing, I finally regained my composure enough to put the Jeep in reverse and take my foot off the clutch and speed down out of there. My friend said later he thought I was going to roll the Jeep. He didn't know what I had seen, but he did see me staring out of the window. I let out a scream as we backed down the steep road until we reached the pavement and drove away as fast as the Jeep would go. A couple of miles down the road, I pulled over and I changed places with my friend as I was too impacted by the encounter to drive safely. This time, we did go to the swell, but the trip was a bust for me due to what I had witnessed. What else did 2005 have in store? And as it turned out, that was not the final strange experience of the year. But I won't recite another UFO experience. My poor wife was seeing them in the mountains by our home, and it shook her to her core. I want to share some observations. Prior to these experiences, I had never seen anything unusual or out of place in my outdoor life. Suddenly, I knew the truth about things that most people will never know. Regarding the 2 clearly identifiable Bigfoot creatures, I've already said that the first black creature we saw felt intensely evil, but I did not have the same feeling about the second grizzled one. Its face was 9 feet from my face, but it never grimaced at me or displayed any threatening behavior. It could have easily opened its mouth to growl at us and show us its teeth, but its mouth remained closed. Yes, I was terrified and petrified with fear from simply seeing this monster up close. But I didn't feel any fear being projected from this creature as many people report. If anything, it seemed to purposefully not do anything to terrorize us whatsoever. With that being said, I've never been able to bring myself to visit that bridge again or camp out since 2005. I still go fly fishing as often as health permits, but I never go unarmed if we're off the beaten path. In October of 2019, 14 years after the bridge sighting, I had another Bigfoot encounter at a small lake in northern Utah called Mill Hollow, where I was fishing by myself. No one else was at the lake that day. I didn't have a visual this time, but a mature white fur was pushed over nearby, and the creatures made a sound I can only describe as a symphony orchestra with all the strings and wind and brass instruments striking the same note together, accompanied by multiple car horns. The intensely loud sound lasted for a single quarter note. They had my attention, and I assumed that rather than scream at me, they made this less threatening sound so as not to alarm the numerous bull elk that were bugling in the mountains around me, and I suspected that this was a hunting party and they wanted me gone. I gathered my fly rods and other gear and I left the area. I've read other accounts of these things making all sorts of sounds, but I've never heard anyone report them sounding like a symphony orchestra. And last, in February of this year, 2021, one night at 12:30 a.m., something slapped the side of our home so hard that it felt like the house would come off its foundation. The slap was on the second floor on the other side of the wall from my head. It reverberated through the house, and my youngest son in the basement called me wondering what had just happened. I instantly knew what had happened. One of the Bigfoot creatures that I had encountered found where I was living and must have climbed up to the rock chimney and let me know that they knew where I was at. So many people have recorded such events of being harassed by these creatures that I wasn't surprised, but I took measures to hopefully keep it from happening again. And I hate the feeling of being a marked man. Well, Cam, that's my story. You're welcome to share it if you desire. I could share other recent cryptid encounters, but I'm still trying to make peace with the idea of the massive upright canine variety. This world is not what I thought it was growing up on the farm or during all the years of hunting, fishing, and camping. No, not at all. We share this world with things that none of us are prepared for in our pathetic educational system. For some reason, the door to all these things opened wide for me in 2005, and it's never closed since. If I was to recount all of our strange encounters, it would require another email of this length or longer. Thankfully, the truth about many of these topics are coming to light, and thanks for allowing me to get this off my chest. Dixiecryptid is fantastic, thank you. Cam, you're the best, with my kindest regards, and then he signs off. And He copied my little avatar from my email and put it at the bottom of his email. Well, I'm not commenting much on the end of these stories, but I just wanted to tell the man how much I appreciate him sending this story. This is actually the second version of it. He had done some editing and found some typos. You guys don't have to do that. If it's little errors you find, don't obsess over these stories. Just send them on. We take a look at them. We read them through before we narrate them. But I just thought this was a fantastic story, and I wanted to let him know that I know you're battling MS, you're in your 60s, and your story is out there, and your time was not wasted. It's very enlightening and entertaining. So I appreciate the writer. Thank you. All right, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I hope everybody's having a great Thanksgiving, and you're laying around in your recliners, rubbing your bellies, and trying to stay awake. Hope you have a great weekend if you listen to this at another time. I appreciate you joining me. We'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks.